almost, I think, half of our income is going on rent. So half of your working week is working for your landlord. This housing crisis is a political choice. It's a political choice that's been upheld since Thatcher times. This experiment of public housing has fundamentally failed. Politicians need to accept that, and they need to build public housing. My name is Becca, and I am one of the coordinating group members of the London Renters Union.
Can you tell me what it's like to rent in London?
It's precarious and it's unstable, and those of us renting in London are pretty much living in fear, because with the recent rent hikes and also the rent increases that have been going on for decades, it means that people are having to make really tough choices between renting, paying their rent and feeding their children. And most of our income, almost I think half of our income, is going on rent. So half of your working week is working for your landlord. And people are living in unsafe homes because there's a lack of enforcement for the few protections that renters have. I've heard stories or met with other members of the Renters Union who have had things like roofs falling on them. That's quite a common story for some reason. Or are concerned about their children's health because of the level of mould that's in their houses. So what's changed in the last year has been obviously the cost of living crisis, and that has meant that lots of people's rent has gone up to something like 30%. I've seen people whose rent has gone up by £400 to £500, and when they try to negotiate these rent increases, they're served with a Section 21 eviction notice, so they just get kicked out for no reason, and then having to go to another place and still pay that rent increase anyway. Housing fundamentally is a human right, and what we've seen is housing since Margaret Thatcher times and the bringing in of policies like right to buy, where council homes were sold off and most of our homes are now owned by private landlords. Our housing system is run for profit and not run as if it's a human right. So we're having to balance our rights against someone else's need to make profit, and that's just simply, it's just not fair. As a young person, I can't speak for all young people, but for me and everyone that I know, I am not enjoying renting. I do not like the fact that I can move into a house and I can't plan for my future. I can't be like, okay, I'm going to live here for the next few years and this is the job I'm going to do. Maybe I want to have children. I can't plan that because my contracts only last 6 to 12 months. And after that, I can just be kicked out with 8 weeks notice. And that is fundamentally the problem. That's not fun. That's not fun for anybody. When you're inside these homes and you want to feel like it's your home, I mean, it is your home, but it's not viewed like that when it's run for profit. So you're walking around in what is somebody else's asset, and they're telling you, oh, you can't put a poster up here, or you can't put a shelf up here. That's not living in a home. That's not having autonomy over your space and where you live. And we should be able to feel safe and secure in homes that are ours. The government and the Labour Party are talking a lot about homeowners and mortgage holders, but fundamentally, people are not talking about renters. People are not thinking about what we can do to help renters, what politicians and the government can do to help renters. And what we need is two things. We need, in the short term, we need urgent action and emergency measures to deal with this cost of living crisis. And that should come in the form of rent freezes, like what we saw in Scotland, where there was a rent freeze and then that's led to rent caps. We need that here as well. We had caps on energy prices. There's no reason why we should not have that on rent increases as well. The long-term measure needs to be the government investing in public housing, the government building and sustaining public housing that people can access, affordable housing that people can access for a long period of time. The media like to portray all landlords as this single person who's just bought a house and just wants to rent it out for a period of time and is not trying to make profit off of it. But what we know is that a lot of these kind of new buildings that are coming up and property are rent by landlords who own multiple properties. They're owned by big corporate developers who are their only goal and motivation is making profit. And we can't let something that is a human right be run on the premise of making profit. I find it infuriating when, houses are built that aren't thinking about the need of us as renters. They're not built with us in mind. These contracts that are given by the council to these developers are not thinking about what do the renters here need. They're not listening to us. I personally do not know anybody who's waiting for a nice juicy deposit from their parents to get housing. As a member of the London Renters Union, I come across renters, hundreds of renters all of the time, and that's just not their situation. They're living like in constant fear of their house, of the unsafe conditions of their house, and of the fact that they can't settle and plan for their financial future because most of their money is going on rent, and they just can't plan for their family's future in these houses where they could get kicked out in the next 12 months. It's not feasible that I'm going to save up a £20,000 deposit. I and other renters in London are putting hundreds and thousands of pounds into this housing system that we will not benefit from in the long term. This housing crisis is a political choice. It's a political choice that's been upheld since Thatcher times, since the Right to Buy scheme. Successive governments and politicians and prime ministers have upheld these political choices that have meant that most of our housing is in the private sector and for profit. So they can make another political choice and create a housing system that is actually for the majority of the people. And that can only really happen in the long term through building public housing. It's nothing short of an emergency. People are struggling and, as I've said, living in fear. So that needs to happen now. And what needs to happen is to understand that this experiment of public housing has fundamentally failed. It's a failed experiment, and we need to accept that. Politicians need to accept that, and they need to build public housing. They need to take stock from the private rented sector and put it back into public housing. Politicians and people on the media talk about if we put in rent caps, if we freeze rents, then landlords are going to leave the market. And landlords have been saying that for years, and it's scaremongering. If they leave the market, quite frankly, good riddance, because that would mean that we would have properties that councils and government should be supporting councils to buy this stock back and give it to people as public housing. There shouldn't be empty houses and people living on the streets or people living in temporary accommodation. We should have legislation that protects renters. We don't have much of it. As renters, we don't have many rights, but there are so many protections for landlords. There are so many checks that you go through to rent. It's quite an aggressive check when you start renting, but you don't have those checks for landlords. And there's an imbalance of power, and we need to rebalance those scales.